My assignment was to find some articles to support some questions I had for online learning. And so the topic I picked was forming groups for online learning. What are best practices? So in the fall, I'm going to be teaching a course that is hybrid. It'll be lectures online, asynchronous, and then the lab is face-to-face. And so I want to figure out exactly what am I going to do with the online portion besides the informational lecture, which will probably be in the format of this. Am I going to have any type of asynchronous discussion groups also for that class? And then when we meet face-to-face, am I going to have groups? And will those be the same groups? Will I keep the groups the same through the semester? So I wanted to find some research-based information and suggestions for my course. And the thing about education is it's excellent and it gives other educators ideas and what's worked. But we always have to remember that a lot of these are case studies. And so the class might not be exactly as mine. So it's always good to see what worked, and then I can try that, and then I can kind of tweak it for my own class. So some of my questions were, what is the best size for a group? How should I form the groups? And should the groups remain the same for the entire semester? So is there an optimum group size? This article talked about a hybrid course for medical students. And although I don't have medical students, this is chemistry, it's a science class. So there are some similarities. And the conclusion was students have a positive perception of teaching when you have groups that are small. And so one thing you'll notice is they thought 11 to 13 students was a small group. And in particular, the groups benefited communication, confidence, problem solving, and critical thinking. Can small groups be utilized before whole class discussion? So maybe you have a topic, and this was what they did is they formed small groups and they had discussions in the small groups, and then they brought the class together as a whole group discussing the same thing. And their small groups were 4 or 5 students. So you can see what a small group is to one class isn't exactly a small group to another class, because the previous article said 11 to 13 was small. And so this was a synchronous online course, and it was felt that it is beneficial to maybe have a small group when you have a topic that you're discussing, and then you can all come together as a large group. And one thing about all these articles is you can see that this was heavy on case-based learning. And so it wasn't just about groups. And so a lot of what they determined was effective really also related to case-based learning. But that's another thing I can take home to what do I want to have in my discussion groups. What if you have an asynchronous discussions? Because that's what I'm going to have. And this one said had groups with 12 and then groups with 23. And they didn't really find that there was any difference in the learning outcome for these nurses if it was 12 students or 23. But the students seemed to feel that they were digging deeper into the information, into the content, when they only had 12 in the group as opposed to 23. So for me, I take home that, 23 would be like my whole class. I definitely want to have groups because a group of 23 is my entire class. So that won't work for me. What are some critical characteristics to successful small group design? And so this one had multiple characteristics of small groups were analyzed. And they suggested groups of 4 or 5 students was good. And like most of the articles, there were other things that they found out. The articles, none of the articles were strictly on group size. And this one, the students thought deadlines were appropriate. And preference for individual work was suggested over group projects. And the reason for that is they felt group projects, it was really hard just to find a time to work with their classmates. So this obviously was asynchronous. And the other thing which I wanted to know is, should I keep 60 students to keep it the same? Now, whether or not that's the best for teaching, I don't know, but it is what the students preferred. And sometimes it seems like, well, if you've got a good thing going and they like the groups, then you should keep it. You know, if that's what works, then just keep it. When might a larger group be more beneficial? And this was a very interesting article because they were actually analyzing for higher levels of knowledge on online discussion. And there was, I think, 5 levels, and it was very detailed of how to analyze it. And they had people analyze it, and then they had to find out the reproducibility, the validity. They had more people analyze it to make sure that the analysis was the same. This was actually a good article. And they actually had the 10 groups of 10 was better than groups of 8. So here you see the groups here are even larger. But they admitted that there's a lot of other factors that are important besides group size. And it only plays a very small part of your pedagogical practices. And what factors should be paired with small groups? So this had 444 students. So now we're getting into some really decent sized numbers of students that are, beyond case studies, which you can argue, okay, is you have to have 30 for a case study or not, but I won't go into that. And they studied a lot of different variables besides group size. Like I said, I didn't find anything, I think, that was strictly on group size. So they talked about, physical versus virtual, which is like we call face-to-face versus online, convergent versus divergent assignments, homogeneous versus heterogeneous grouping, instructor versus peer, and of course group size. And the group size, small they said 2 to 4 students, large was 5 to 8. So here again, the number in the group is completely different in this article. When they only looked at group size, they found that small groups were better in performance and satisfaction, but not collaboration. But that's when they looked at nothing but group size. But when they started to look at multi-factor analysis, it was really interesting. So when they did face-to-face, small groups scored better on outcome and collaboration, but not satisfaction. Did online, larger groups scored higher on performance, satisfaction, and collaboration. When they looked at convergent and divergent, they found that small groups are better on convergent assignments and large groups are better on divergent assignments. And that's pretty interesting to keep in mind, I think. I think that's one thing I want to keep in mind. So what about how can you form groups? So this article talks about a computer program where they, take a whole bunch of different characteristics of students. The students fill it out, and then the teachers say what factors do they want to use, how big are the groups, etc. And it seemed really great until I found out it was $35 per student. So that doesn't really work for me. Then I found another one that used a computer program, but I couldn't find the website. It just seems like they were describing how they did the program. So this seemed to be more explaining how they developed that program. So that one didn't really help me much. This was a really interesting article. I'd never thought of anything like this. I really like this. And what it is they would just observe the students in the face-to-face course and then use that information to form the online groups. And the biggest suggestion was, when you form the groups, you look at in the whole entire class, who participated more. And they said there's not a lot of variation of how those students online. So what you really need to do is form heterogeneous groups where your students that participate online, who participate more in the whole class, pair them with students that don't participate as much. And that's how you form your heterogeneous groups. And I really liked that. I thought it was a great thing to think of. Interesting. It's common sense once you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense, but it was an interesting article that I think could be beneficial to me. So in conclusion, there was a great deal of information in the articles. And I mean, as you can see, what someone thought a small group was, some said 4 or 5, some said 10, 12. So it was different, what is the size group. But what I gained from this was, one, I'm going to observe the entire class before I try to form groups, and then make them heterogeneous by participation level. And also, there was an article, one of these articles that said, forming groups, heterogeneous groups, when you're like race, religion, gender, age, all that, that's not necessarily a good thing to do. It's not, I mean, it's okay if it happens, but that's not necessarily the greatest way to group. I mean, you shouldn't try to steer away from it, but just maybe not use that as your decision of how to group students. And the other article that, again, this wasn't one of my questions, but was really interesting to me, is that, really think twice about, do you want to put groups together heterogeneously by academic ability? Because, it's like, oh, well, the student that faster can help the other students. That's not always the best way to group students. And so there was a number of reasons, and I didn't present this, but there were a number of reasons of why you might not want to do that. And so even though that wasn't one of my questions, that is something that I discovered. And so here are my references with the links. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask me. And thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation.